On the 29th of December in 2019, David Moyes rejoined West Ham after a stint in the 17-18 season where he took over the club for around 6 months and then left after his contract expired and after a pre-agreement with Manuel Pellegrini. The stint with Pellegrini, it all went pear-shaped, and David Moyes came back. And West Ham were in a big relegation battle. West Ham were also linked to Niko Kovac at the time and Eddie Howe. But David Moyes was the one that got the job, and the owners wanted to bring him back. Today's video is about David Moyes' stint from 2019 to 2024. Now, in the 1920 season, obviously David Moyes' first game was against Bournemouth, and that was a 4-0 win. And that was, it was his first game, comfortably beat Bournemouth. We get to the January transfer window, and obviously there's a lot of discontent with the owners and how they're running the club in general. The first two signings that ended up making a great impact at the club was Jared Bowen and Thomas Souček. They were both signed in that January. Thomas Souček was actually signed on loan initially, but we would then trigger a buy option, or we would end up just buying him permanently in 2020 summer. And Thomas Souček made an instant impact, so did Jared Bowen. It didn't start off completely well for David Moyes. He had to face Liverpool twice as well. Had to face Manchester City, which was the last game before COVID came into place. He also got knocked out by former West Ham manager Slaven Bilic in the fourth round of the FA Cup at home to West Brom. That was a dark time as a West Ham fan. We obviously still had players like, Roberto just left in that January. We brought back Darren Randolph as the backup keeper. Carlos Sanchez was still there. Felipe Anderson was still there. It wasn't great. There was a lot of discontent with the defence as well. Gordon was not on form. Diop was not on form. Balbuena was not on form. There was problems with right back. We brought through Jeremy Ngakia after I think Ben Johnson was injured at the time. He was coming through, but also Ryan Fredericks and Zabaleta. Zabaleta at the back end of his career wasn't a Zabaleta that you would have seen at Manchester City, and Ryan Fredericks cannot defend. Moyes said in his first interview as well, "That's what I do, I win," was the exact quote, basing off his record in the Premier League. And I think after Fergie and Wenger, he's won the most games in the Premier League, or he's had the most games, him and Harry Redknapp. And I think at the time it was actually Harry Redknapp, but he might have been fourth. I think he actually recently took over a year or two ago in terms of the record. But as it carried on, COVID hit after that Manchester City game. But what happened was that West Ham, that was probably one of the better things that actually happened to West Ham. And also, luckily, teams like Watford and Norwich were very mediocre at the time. We were battling relegation with Aston Villa, who actually survived on the last day after getting a draw against West Ham. And after COVID, I think pretty sure the first two games West Ham lost, and it was against Burnley and Wolves at home. But the wins against Chelsea and Norwich, the 3-2 game where Yarmolenko scored at the end, and beating Norwich 4-0, beating Watford 3 or 4-1. There were a few games where West Ham came into form and they ended up surviving. And that was the 1920 season. And especially with Moyes coming in 17th at the time. That's what it was. And West Ham ended up finishing 16th. And we did have to leave it to the last day to survive relegation. It was a really, really, really bad season. A really bad season. It was horrible to watch under Pellegrini, even under David Moyes at times as well. But we then get onto the 2021 season. This is obviously the first full season without fans. Fans only came in for the last two games. Now, if we're going back to one of Moyes' interviews, something that didn't ever come into fruition, which is kind of a bit of a theme going into the David Moyes reign at West Ham, is the Red Bull model. Now, Moyes said in a club interview, even in the 1920 season, about wanting to bring young player throughs and liking the Red Bull model. Now, West Ham this season, in the 2023-24 season, ended up having one of the oldest squads in the league alongside Fulham on average, in terms of average age. So that didn't age well. Another reason why it didn't age well is because in the 2021 season, obviously, it was hard for everyone in terms of finances and stuff. But what didn't make sense was the business to at the time sell Grady Diangana, which was a youngster that was actually impressing in pre-season and getting the best out of Sebastian Haller, who was a striker that West Ham signed in the previous season under Pellegrini. Now, Sebastian Haller ended up flopping at West Ham because of the lack of service and the lack of ability to actually fit him into the Moyes system, which was a system that only really a Mikel Antonio type striker could actually fit in. But Grady Diangana at the time would be a guy in pre-season that, especially at Ipswich away, would get the best out of Haller. The ability to combine and be direct on crosses. West Ham ended up selling Grady Diangana and terminating the contracts of Josh Cullen and Jack Wilshere, bringing in Saeed Benrahma on loan, who ended up joining on a permanent deal, and that goes the exact same for Craig Dawson as well. But Vladimir Sufa was the only permanent signing of that transfer window for the first team. Now, there became a lot of discontent when it came to the Grady Diangana situation. Mark Noble came out and tweeted stuff. Jack Wilshere left an Instagram comment, and a lot of players liked the tweet of Mark Noble. A lot of discontent with the fans, and GSBL was trending on Twitter. So a lot of people were angry anyway, and it was toxic even without fans there. Now, this all stemmed into the late ends of pre-season where West Ham got battered by Bournemouth in the Betway Cup, and then filters through into the first part of the season where West Ham lost to Newcastle 2-0 after a front pairing of Andy Carroll and Callum Wilson. And Andy Carroll being a former player at West Ham United, actually being in the squad where Moyes was there for the first time. But also Callum Wilson, a man who always scored against West Ham and always did score against West Ham United. Throughout then, it became completely weird. When Vladimir Sufa signed, it almost transformed West Ham a little bit. West Ham lost a few games, losing to people like Arsenal, losing to Arsenal and stuff, and they were looking at West Ham's run and thinking they're going to be 20th by Christmas, having to face the likes of Wolves, Leicester, Chelsea, Manchester City, Liverpool, Man United. And what happened is that West Ham got a really good comeback against Tottenham, the Manuel Lanzini goal at 3-3. West Ham beat Leicester away at their ground 3-0. And they beat Wolves at home 4-0. And at the time, Wolves were a really good team. They had a bit of a drop-off in that season, but they had finished in European places or in the top 8 twice in a row. And Leicester was a team that also finished in European places in that season and the previous season. They've actually finished above West Ham, I think one place above West Ham. West Ham and Leicester taking up the 5th and 6th place in that position in the league. And no one knew where West Ham were going to finish at this point. West Ham were around European places. But the dream was on. And in my opinion at the time, if people want to know my feelings at the time, because this was actually around 6 months before I actually opened up this YouTube channel, is I never ever thought we were going to get Europe. Never ever thought, even when in the running, up until the last international break. But what boosted West Ham United getting into Europe was the signing of Jesse Lingard. Now, fun fact, I actually remember messaging my Manchester United, one of my Manchester United friends that's obviously a fan of Man United, and I said, I can't believe we signed a backup dancer. And I was just taking the piss. And I wasn't happy with the signing at the time, because also was the fact that we didn't sign a striker after letting go Sebastian Haller. Robert Snodgrass also left as well. But Lingard, whether it was playing in a false nine, playing off the left, playing off the right, or playing just behind a striker, was on the greatest purple patch I've ever seen at West Ham. And specifically purple patch, because I've seen great form from certain players like Payet and Rice. But Lingard was on sensational form. Even when he wasn't scoring at the end, he was still performing. And people were going mainly off goals when they were judging his performances, but he was still playing well. And he made a great impact into the counter-attacking side. Also, see great seasons from Mikel Antonio when he was fit. Declan Rice, of course. Thomas Souček, Aaron Cresswell, and Vladimir Sufa are probably the players that stand out specifically from that season. Jared Bowen played his part, but it wasn't the same Jared Bowen. A lot of people were demanding a little bit more from Jared Bowen, including myself. However, there was a time where West Ham was scoring a lot, but also conceding a lot. Now, this wasn't as bad as the relegation battle. But however, people might remember the fact that West Ham drew 3-3 to Arsenal after being 3-1 up. We lost 3-2 to Newcastle with 10 men. Craig Dawson getting sent off. Just about beating Leicester and Wolves 3-2 in those respective games as well. But Declan Rice also got injured. Before that Leicester Wolves game happened, Declan Rice got injured on England duty, on international duty in the England game. I'm pretty sure it was against Bulgaria or something like that. And Jesse Lingard actually played that specific game, but that also had to include like some Mark Noble coming in. Declan Rice would only come in for the last 2 games of the season. Manuel Lanzini was sometimes playing midfield, Pablo Fornals as well. And in the end, what happened was West Ham would lose to people like Everton at home. It was Everton at home. Ancelotti put on a defensive masterclass. Calvert-Lewin on through on goal. He put the ball in the back of the net. Don't get me wrong, West Ham played really well in some games, but there were some games where West Ham could have maybe got Champions League football. In fact, after the Brighton game, where Saïd Benrahma scores his first goal, when we drew 1-1 with Brighton, Declan Rice said the Champions League, we saw the Champions League lights, and I think the whole team pretty much felt that they had missed out on Champions League at the time. However, West Ham did get Europa League and confirmed Europe by beating West Brom away from home, beating them 3-1, but also beating Southampton 3-0 and battling against Tottenham on the last day of the season for Conference League and Europa League football. Now, it's funny because we actually did have something to play for, and Tottenham ended up beating Leicester with Ryan Mason in charge, but I was actually very confident that we beat Southampton. I've never been more confident in a West Ham team ever, because I've just been so used to seeing honestly crap teams at the time. And Moyes got West Ham to 6th place, which was the first time West Ham have got Europe properly, because we got Europe under Bilic, but it wasn't the same. One was because of fair play or something like that in the 14-15 season under Allardyce, and then we lost to Astragugu, and then we lost to Astragugu again after finishing in Europe through the league, and I think we finished 7th or 8th. In the 15-16 season, and we lost to the same Romanian team twice, who are now actually extinct. So we lost to a team that ended up becoming extinct. Only at West Ham. We then move on. So this was actually the last season where the Euros happened, because the Euros was actually meant to happen in 2020. Obviously, because of lockdown, the Euros happened in 2021, and Declan Rice was there. Thomas Souček was there. They actually played against each other in a group game. Rice against Souček and Soufal, and soon-to-be West Ham player Alex Crow, who we'll get onto in a minute. England obviously got to the final. But West Ham needed to do business, and the Euros was not only affecting that business, but Moyes coming in was very much under control of transfer business and approving signings, and having a great voice in approving signings as well. Now, due to the fact that we've got 2 different days working with each other, that's David Moyes and David Sullivan working with each other, West Ham signings were very late. Like Alex Crow and Nikola Vlasic were 2 of the signings in the 21-22 season, which we'll move on to now, that were signed on deadline day. 2 players that never really got a chance at the club. Nikola Vlasic would end up going on to play barely any games. There was times where he was fit and a substitution and was never played, a bit like how Maxwell Cornet now. Nikola Vlasic expressed how he kept getting played off the left, and he already had to battle at Everton and failing off the left. That's what happened to Nikola Vlasic. Alex Crow said that David Moyes had poor management skills and wouldn't even speak to him at times. So Moyes approved the signing clearly for depth, but I'm pretty sure Alex Crow only played 1 league game, and that was Watford away. I could be wrong, but that was the only league game I can remember Alex Crow playing, was the 4-1 against Watford. But going back to the start of the season in the transfer window, 2 big signings that will end up going on to do good things is Alphonse Areola on loan. We would then go on to buy him the next season. But also Kurt Zouma. Kurt Zouma signed. I was a big fan of Kurt Zouma at Chelsea anyway. I wanted him at West Ham. We were actually linked to a double deal of Kurt Zouma and Tammy Abraham, and I wanted them both at the club. We ended up missing out on Tammy Abraham, and I'm pretty sure he didn't want to come to us, and Mourinho called him to come to Roma. You don't really say no to Mourinho. But West Ham were linked to a lot of strikers and didn't sign a striker again, which would come back to bite West Ham in the arse once again in this season. But also in this season, it was another great start to the season. And unlike the previous year, where it was like Newcastle game where it was toxic and losing to Arsenal beforehand, in the 2021 season. In the 21-22 season, West Ham would go on to beat Newcastle 4-2 at the start. Then go on to beat 4-1 at Leicester, with Antonio breaking the record of the goals to be West Ham's top goal scorer in the Premier League. And obviously doing that iconic celebration of the Dirty Dancing where he lifts his own cardboard car in the air. I think Pablo Fornals also scored on the day as well. And it was the first full season in Europe. And going off the top of my head, I remember drawing to Southampton 0-0, despite losing to Brentford and Man United at home. We ended up beating Aston Villa away at the time, putting one of the nails in Dean Smith's coffin at Aston Villa. Also beating Tottenham at home, beating Liverpool at home, and then around the Christmas period beating Chelsea at home. We'll come back to the Liverpool game in a minute. Because Lingard scored against us for Manchester United and didn't celebrate, and sadly that we should have got over the line, but Lingard wanted to do an extra year at Man United for whatever reason. And since that, he didn't really get much of a chance, and he ended up wanting to leave for Newcastle in the end. A big game that you can actually go and watch on the channel, the full penalty shootout of, is actually onto the YouTube channel, is the Man City Carabao Cup game, where West Ham actually beat Manchester City. Alphonse Areola had a masterclass of a game. Man City pretty much should have won. They should have finished their chances. West Ham did play somewhat well, but it was a West Ham second team in the end that held on to a half-rotated Manchester City side as well. And we ended up drawing 0-0, ended up going to penalties in the end, and West Ham won on penalties. And it was a great night. And you can see the full penalty shootout on the YouTube channel. If you just if you set it to videos and then go to oldest, you'll be able to find it. Liverpool and Chelsea were both respective 3-2 wins. The Liverpool game is kind of where the last of the prime David Moyes team, when you look back. And this is all hindsight, people. This is all hindsight, but that's where it truly went wrong, and I'll explain why in a minute. Now, what happened was, on that day, obviously, we had a decent partnership of Angelo Ogbonna and Kurt Zouma. Angelo Ogbonna would actually get injured in this match and be out for the rest of the season, and we wouldn't see the same Ogbonna again. We wouldn't. But Kurt Zouma would also get injured in the Chelsea match. So then we would have to go with a Diop and Dawson partnership. And it wasn't bad depth at the time. It's not the worst depth in the world, but a Diop and Dawson partnership was not working. It was not working throughout the season. And the injuries kind of set off a West Ham team that not only burnt out, but also needed reinforcements in January for this counter-attacking side. And we didn't sign anyone in January, which was one of the worst things that West Ham did in their recent history, is not signing anyone in that January to then push on for not only a top 4 place, because we was around the top 4 place for a very long time, even though we barely won a game in 2022, but also to maybe get to the Europa League final. Now, we'll get onto that in a minute, because this was the first season in Europe, and at the time, West Ham had, if I can remember off the top of my head, they had Dynamo Zagreb, they had Rapid Vienna, and they had Genk. I think it was Genk, because we faced Ghent the next year, so it's one of the two. They're both similar. Faced all 3 of them, and apart from the fact that we had to play our second, that didn't have to, but we gave a lot of youngsters a chance in the game against Zagreb. That was the only game we lost. Other than that, we drew away at Genk, and we topped the group by winning every other game. I'm pretty sure we confirmed top of the group by beating Rapid Vienna away, with Mark Noble scoring a penalty as well, and Sonny Perkins getting a chance, who ended up leaving for Leeds. And it was all going high. All in a high. West Ham had topped the group in Europe, unfortunately losing to Tottenham in the Carabao Cup. After an okay run, we actually beat Man United away for once. We'd never win at Old Trafford, and we never beat Manchester City, but we did both of that. Manchester United had their second team, West Ham had their second team. But funny enough, West Ham could only make 10 changes to their second team because West Ham barely had a squad. So Jared Bowen was the only senior player that actually played. And a good goal from Lanzini obviously beat Man United to then beat Man City to then lose to Tottenham. That's a very hard run, but even though we played somewhat well against Tottenham away, we should have won in that game. It was an early Antonio Conte Tottenham. It was all going on high. Unfortunately, losing to the Carabao Cup, on top of the group in Europe, and being around in the European places, from 4th to 6th mainly, throughout the January period. West Ham signed no one in January. Now, David Moyes actually came out the next season, in the 22-23 season, and said he rejected not Edson Alvarez, Julian Alvarez, because Mikel Antonio was doing well. Now, the problem is, what Moyes doesn't understand is that there's competition. That is a thing in football. So that was a big problem already, the fact that we actually rejected Julian Alvarez. I don't think Julian Alvarez would have done well at this club purely because he wouldn't have suited the system anyway. But what he could have done is signed Julian Alvarez and had him as a bench player whilst Antonio was doing well. And when Antonio wasn't doing well, you bring Alvarez in. Also, late bids for Rafinha from Leeds, Calvin Phillips from Leeds, who ended up joining West Ham this season, by 50 million each. Both got rejected by Leeds as they were in a relegation battle, but also a rejection of a bid from Benfica to sign Darwin Núñez. Now, people forget, because Darwin Núñez signed for Liverpool, West Ham were in for him. And it's weird because a lot of these deals were done at the end. Or a lot of these deals were trying to be pursued right at the end of the transfer window. So a lot of people were like, well, we're just panicking again. And that might have been true. But we didn't sign anyone in the end. I don't actually remember if anyone left in that January transfer window. But what happened was no one was signed. So the squad was as it was. We had one real left back. We had two right backs, so Ben Johnson would fill in for both. And Aaron Cresswell ended up becoming really washed in that season. And his legs had fully gone after having a great season the previous season. This was also the last season of Mark Noble, who we'll come to in a minute. People like Ben Rama were doing okay. Popular Fornals was having a good season. Bowen was really coming into his own from the Liverpool game onto the end of the season. Would get him an England call-up into the international duty. Mikel Antonio was doing well for all he could because he was being played every game. The guy needed a rest. He was getting way overplayed. Declan Rice had a great season. Fabianski had a decent season as well. And Kurt Zouma, when he played, he had a good season. But Dawson was coming into his own. And we'll come on to now the European stages where, obviously, in this was the new rule where if you finish second in your group, you have to go to a playoff. But West Ham finished top their group, so they went straight to the round of 16. Now, West Ham first game was against the most successful team in the Europa League, I'm pretty sure, and that is Sevilla. Now, Sevilla won a lot of Europa Leagues, and funny enough, their manager was Julian Lopetegui, who's actually going to join West Ham, funny enough. But this was the problem. West Ham were coming up against the most successful Europa League team of all time after being in their first season of Europe. So how were West Ham going to pursue this? Now, what gave it a real big advantage to West Ham is the 1-0 was the away leg was first, where West Ham would actually go on to lose 1-0. And I thought, you could go watch old videos on the channel, I thought it was over. I didn't think we were going to beat Sevilla. I was gutted when we got Sevilla. Anthony Martial was playing as well. Not that means anything, but he was there. And we took it back to the second leg and had the best night at the London Stadium probably ever. And that was a 2-0 win to make it 2-1 in aggregate after Yarmolenko coming back from the whole Ukraine war situation, taking a break out of football after the whole Ukraine war situation, scoring against Aston Villa in the league, and crying and falling to his knees and crying, and then scoring against Sevilla. Yarmolenko ended up becoming a cult hero after being berated at this club by people like myself. I didn't think he was good at it. I didn't think he was good at the club. He pissed me off, but he ended up cementing himself as a cult hero. And the reason why, and one of the last straws for Yarmolenko at the time is a game I've actually just missed out on, which I will briefly talk about, is the fact that West Ham actually nearly lost to Kidderminster, who were, I'm pretty sure, were in the 5th tier of English football, which is a league below League 2. And West Ham were so close to losing. And Yarmolenko was having a stinker. He was trying to win a penalty by diving in a box against Kidderminster. But Declan Rice and Jared Bowen saved West Ham right at the end. Declan Rice scored right at the end of the full-time whistle. Jared Bowen scored right at the end of the extra time whistle. And That could have been the biggest upset in FA Cup history. But West Ham just about survived after playing the second team. And it ended up working in the end. So we moved back onto the European games, and West Ham beat Sevilla. Nobody in their right minds could ever believe that West Ham United were ever going to beat Sevilla. But goals from Thomas Souček and Yarmolenko ended up saving West Ham. And we played really well in that night. Soaking up pressure, to hit them on the counter, to finding out opportunities. Antonio having a mixed night, but when he was effective, he was effective. And everyone else playing their part. West Ham were great that night. And I'm pretty sure Jared Bowen was injured after getting injured against Liverpool away from home, losing 1-0 at Anfield. I'm pretty sure he got injured and he was worried about his England hopes. So he ended up coming back in the end. For the next game, against Lyon. Now, the reason why I'm missing out on so many league games is because this would be a trend in 2022 where West Ham would lose quite a lot of league games because the fact that the squad needs to be rejuvenated and they were relying on the same 15 players. Moyes likes a small squad, so this is what you're going to get with a small squad. That's why he will never get higher than the 7th or 6th, because Moyes likes working with a small squad. And even with the small squad, he doesn't even like using all the players there. So that was a big fault in Moyes' game there. However, West Ham did have a good season then. West Ham ended up finishing 7th, but before we get to that, Lyon. Now, Lyon at home was a very frustrating game. Aaron Cresswell, it was debatable whether he should have got sent off for that or not. The referee was very, very bad on the night. But I never even complain then because we had another leg. Now, the problem was Kurt Zouma got injured against Brentford on the weekend game, so we had to go in with a partnership that's not worked all season with Issa Diop and Craig Dawson. Moussa Dembele winked at the camera. The admin on Twitter was very cocky into thinking that they wouldn't win the game. They were at home. But little did they know, and little did I know, I thought we would lose on the night, that West Ham would end up battering Lyon at their own ground. Now, the corner came in, and Craig Dawson, I'm pretty sure, was the one that opened the scoring. In fact, Jared Bowen scored in the first leg. Jerome Boateng had a howler of a game. Funny enough, in the second leg and first leg, coming up against two current West Ham players in Emerson Palmieri and Lucas Paquetá. Now, Paquetá would actually have to come on at half-time because he wasn't fully fit, and Tanguy and Ndombele, who scored in the first leg for Lyon, had the biggest stinker in midfield. They got run over. Rice and Souček kept playing really well. Jared Bowen, Pablo Fornals was playing so good. Manuel Lanzini coming into the side January onwards and changing the side completely, and ended up not really playing that much after that season, unfortunately. But West Ham would end up beating Lyon via goals from Craig Dawson, Declan Rice and Jared Bowen. And that's when the nickname Ballon Dawson would come into fruition after fans would, after one the away fans made a whole banner of Craig Dawson and calling him Ballon Dawson. And TNT Sport ran out with it. They were known as BT Sport at the time. And Colton Cole and Joe Cole would run with that nickname as well. Well, West Ham would comfortably end up beating them. And there was a lot of motivation going into this, wanting to leave with the cup on Mark Noble's last season. But it wouldn't work out. Because the next game that West Ham had was the team that beat Barcelona. That was Frankfurt in the semi-final. Now, going into the first leg, this was one of the few because I wasn't confident for Sevilla and Lyon, and I ended up getting proven wrong. I wanted to be confident for the Frankfurt game. I was like, yeah, we'll beat them. They were so good. There's actually under manager Oliver Glasner at the time. I didn't know who Glasner was at the time, but now I know. I knew he was going to do well for Palace because of this Frankfurt team that I watched. And I didn't want them to win the Europa League either. It was already painful watching the Europa League final after the fact that we weren't in it. That West Ham Rangers final could have been beautiful. But it wasn't to be. And even if we had beat Rangers, we would have gone into the Champions League and not had won a trophy the next season. So I guess everything works out for a reason. But going back a bit, going into the game, Moyes was actually very, very good tactically. His pragmatism was actually working a lot. And the reason why I was working a lot is because he wasn't approaching the same game the same. And what I mean by that, we were sitting back every game, but there was tactical tweaks that he would match up with opposition managers. So what Moyes would do, if he was playing a 3 at the back, sometimes he would go 3 at the back, yes, but sometimes there'll be sometimes we'd go into a 5 off the ball and a 4 on the ball, where Pablo Fornals would actually help out Aaron Cresswell and track their wing back to help out Aaron Cresswell so he can tuck in. So Fornals ended up playing wing back. Now, someone of Fornals' ability shouldn't be playing a wing back. I'm not the biggest fan of Pablo Fornals, but he should have been playing wing back. But it did work because of it. He had an immense work rate at the time, and Pablo Fornals actually did a really good job playing in that position. Now, the whole problem with this is that we were at home at first, but it took just under a minute or a minute where I'm pretty sure it was Kostic that crossed it in and Knuth headed it at the back post to make it 1-0 in the opening minute. Now, West Ham were already chasing the game for the first minute of the first leg. It was a great atmosphere at the time when we started the game, but the atmosphere died in the first minute. And everyone was just a bit broken at the time. West Ham would then end up scoring a set piece under Zuma. But then after great play by Frankfurt, I think I'm pretty sure Adichie Kamada ended up finishing it to make it 2-1. And West Ham would lose the first leg after Jared Bowen hit the bar from an overhead kick as well. Bowen nearly had that exact same chance against Leverkusen this season. But West Ham were going into the second leg, needing to score 2 goals at the Frankfurt Stadium. West Ham would have another bad start, where we would go man-to-man with their front three, meaning Zuma drops in with their attacker, leaving Aaron Cresswell to run in behind, and Aaron Cresswell this time deservedly getting a red card and completely fucking up West Ham's chances of getting a chance into the final. Moyes would have to put on Ben Johnson for Lanzini, and we'll have to go play with the 4-4-1. West Ham would end up being completely rattled. Frankfurt would see out the game. They would score, make it 1-0, and it would be 3-1 in aggregate, and West Ham would lose the game. Declan Rice would complain to the ref talking about corruption at the end. Very rattled. David Moyes was also rattled, kicking the ball at the ball boy. But it was a learning experience, and we had to focus on the league afterwards, where we actually only had 3 league games left. We would end up beating Norwich 4-0. It was actually on Mark Noble's birthday. And then it would get to the game where West Ham United drew to Manchester City 2-2. But more importantly, it was Mark Noble's last home game. And it was very hard to see Mark Noble leave. Because as a West Ham fan, all I knew really was Mark Noble at West Ham. And I would say I started remembering football throughout the 2010-2011 season. And Mark Noble was there then. And Mark Noble was there, obviously, in the 22-23 season, played more of a squad player. For the last 2 seasons of his career was when he was properly playing a squad player. There was times where he needed to be benched before, but because he was Mr. West Ham and captain, he probably was never going to get benched. But he still could have played a role maybe 2 years later, but he decided to retire, and it was very hard to see him go. But we would end up drawing that game. A game we actually should have won against Manchester City, if I'm being completely honest. But the classy Manchester City fans ended up clapping Mark Noble off as well. Man City will claw it back to 2-2. We would then go into the last game of the season, where West Ham pretty much missed out on Europa League football. And they needed them to go to the Amex for the first time and beat Brighton for the first time in the Premier League era. And for Palace to beat Manchester United. Now, Palace ended up beating Manchester United, but Brighton would end up beating West Ham. Now, this isn't really much of a game to talk about, but what was really important is in the press conference of this Brighton West Ham game, in David Moyes' words, David Moyes said this: we need about 10 or 11 players or something like that. We go out with the same squad, we're going to be battling the wrong part of the league. Now, Moyes could see that himself, and also that was due to the 2022 form. The form in 2022 was awful. West Ham would barely win a game. Well, they would win a game here and there, but they would barely win a game in general in 2022. Especially in the league. But now, we transition to the 2022-2023 season. The second season back with fans. And West Ham had high hopes. Now, West Ham were operating differently. They would bring in at the back end of the 2022 season of Rob Newman, who worked at Manchester City. David Moyes would come out on the High Performance podcast that Jake Humphrey does and also say he would like to attack more, be more of an attacking manager. He would then bring in Mark Warburton into the coaching team. And a transfer overhaul would begin. But before we get into the transfer overhaul, West Ham were also linked back to none other than Jesse Lingard. Now, this ended up working out in the end, but at the time it was very frustrating because we were chasing this guy for time. But Lingard ended up going to Forest because they flew him out. They flew him out and he felt like they put more effort in. When really, he did go for the money. There's no shame in saying he'd go for the money. If you just admit you went for the money. But West Ham had European football and Forest were in a relegation battle. And Forest would actually end up replacing Lingard in a couple of weeks by Sonny Gibbs-White. And Lingard would barely play a game. Lingard is now in South Korea. And West Ham won the Conference League last year. So I think we all know who benefited more of that. But the transfer overhaul would begin, starting with Naya Faged signing. And then it was like Alphonse Areola, Flynn Downs, Maxwell Cornet, Gianluca Scamacca, Emerson Palmieri, Thilo Kehrer, and Lucas Paquetá. Now, West Ham addressed a lot of positions. And you could go to the old videos on the channel, I was gassed aside most of them. Actually, one person I wasn't gassed aside was Emerson, and he ended up proving me wrong. I was gassed aside Scamacca, it didn't work out. And we'll get onto that. Paquetá signed. Thilo Kehrer signed because Naya Faged got injured in a pre-season match against Rangers. Going in for a sliding tackle and ended up being injured for 4 or 5 months. Coming back in the Conference League and wouldn't really settle into the league properly up until maybe January, February times. Around Newcastle away, which is probably Naya Faged's best performance in the West Ham shirt, where West Ham actually drew 1-1. But there was a big problem with this whole thing. Now, I don't think anyone can look aside to Moyes wanting to change to attacking football. That's fine, but the problem is, even though Moyes brought in Mark Warburton as a coach to help this attacking football stuff, and made to maybe play a 3 at the back, which was tested a lot in the Conference League and tested a lot in pre-season as well. It never ended up working because Moyes didn't know how to coach it. He would end up not listening to Mark Warburton really, and they would end up having a clash of styles, and Moyes would end up reverting back to his normal style. So now Moyes has brought all these players in for a style he cannot coach, and now he's reverting back to his old style. They don't fit into that style, so most of the players don't really work anyway. Now, luckily, someone like Paquetá is already a dog worker that works hard and puts through balls through, and that worked out in the final, which we'll get onto. But for people like Naya Faged, Thilo Kehrer, Flynn Downs never played. Maxwell Cornet got injured, came back and never played. Scamacca got injured, but also never fit into the Moyes system and wanted to go back to Italy. Emerson would barely play, even though he should have played, because Cresswell had a howler of a season. It wasn't really working out. But there was also a bad start to the league. Now, the first 3 games that West Ham United had in this 22-23 season, which is actually last season now, is Manchester City at home was the first game. West Ham lost 2-0. Nottingham Forest away, the second game. West Ham would lose 1-0. And Brighton at home would make West Ham lose 2-0. Now, there was very little expressions of Moyes out. But it was a minority of people. I remember actually ended up muting a lot of accounts that were saying Moyes out at the time, because I was like, how can you say Moyes out after 3 games and all this, and trusting the manager and stuff. But I would soon turn. We'll get onto that. We didn't score a goal in any of those 3 games. And I was I remember actually when the fixtures came out, I wasn't confident of those first 3 games because we're not going to beat Manchester City. We never do. We never try to. Brighton at home, Brighton away. It doesn't matter. We lose. Luckily, we didn't lose to Brighton this season, but whatever. And also, it was Nottingham Forest's first game back in the Premier League after so long. Now, West Ham actually should have won that game after an awful penalty from Declan Rice. Lingard coming back to bite us, getting an assist. And West Ham hit the crossbar, hit the post, missing sitters. And West Ham would lose that game. Also, a big thing is that West Ham lost 2-0 to Brighton and Manchester City. Now, what Moyes had, especially in 2020 and the first half of the 21-22 season, is that West Ham would never ever lose by more than 1 goal in a game. Meaning they were always in a game, or they always had somewhat of a tight defence. But Arsenal away in the 2021 season, the 21-22 season where West Ham lost 2-0, was the start of a few drubbings, and West Ham would be unfolded throughout the 22-23 season, where it would actually become more of a trend to lose by 2 goals to certain teams, and even worse, get battered. Now, not only was it a change of style and stuff, West Ham also got into the Conference League, where West Ham would remain unbeaten not only in the group stage but throughout the whole campaign. West Ham easily top of the group, coming up against Silkeborg, a team in the Danish league, and playing Viborg in the playoff to get into the Conference League. But also playing Anderlecht as well, also playing a big team like Anderlecht. I actually don't remember who else we faced. I legit cannot remember who else we faced in that Conference League group. I do apologise, but the most important thing was the fact that West Ham actually finished unbeaten throughout that whole group. And what was mad about that was people didn't even think West Ham were going to win that. And it was a third tier European competition side. But West Ham would end up winning that. But again, we'll come back to that in a minute. Where fans started to turn was when West Ham lost to Everton away in the league to Frank Lampard, who ended up giving it to the fans afterwards, and karma would come back to bite Frank Lampard after he would lose 1-0 to West Ham United, or no, in fact 2-0 to West Ham United, and he would end up getting sacked. But that would be the turning point online. Online, a lot of people were starting to be Moyes out. And there was even rumours of Moyes has 4 games left. But this ended up becoming a trend in this season, where every time Moyes would have a game left to prove himself, he would end up beating someone. Now become a trend throughout the whole season. Now, where the match-going fans turned was Palace at home. I wrote Palace away on my notes, but it was Palace at home, because Palace away was later in the season. Palace at home, Paquetá would have an awful game, still settling into the league. Before that, Moyes was playing Flynn Downs in the 10 in Paquetá's absence instead of Fornals or Lanzini. Moyes would force to be playing Benrahma after Benrahma being probably the best West Ham player of that season, despite Declan Rice winning Hammer of the Year. I even said at the time, Benrahma should have won that. Because Declan Rice wasn't that good in the first half of that season. Even Jared Bowen wasn't good in the first half of that season. A lot of people weren't good. But it seemed that it became a mismatch of profiles within that squad. And that was the big problem. A lot of new players and a lot of the current players, they didn't gel together on the pitch because there was a big lack of chemistry. And it would take a long while for West Ham to even go on a little bit of a run. They wouldn't even put a proper run together, which would make West Ham, unfortunately, be in a relegation battle. And Palace at home was one of them. It's one of them games where West Ham actually took the lead for a fantastic side Benrahma goal. And this match reaction to the Palace game is actually one of my most viewed videos onto the channel. You would end up then criticising Benrahma at the time in his press conference, but what really turned the fans on Moyes was taking Benrahma off as a substitute. But fans also went way as he finally took off Thomas Souček, because Thomas Souček was having a horrible game. But Moyes was playing him every game. A big part to why Moyes' style of football fell off is because he was forcing Rice to go box to box. But Rice wasn't a natural box to box midfielder at the time, and Moyes doesn't know how to coach that switch. Meaning Souček and Rice ended up both sitting back, and West Ham would have less of an attacking threat. After it working out with Souček scoring 10 goals because Declan Rice is a more valuable player, he would change that whole system. And that's why Souček didn't even really have his best season in the 21-22 season either. But Michael Elise would end up scoring right at the end. He would end up taking Scamacca off at half-time for Antonio because he thought Scamacca was playing shit even though Scamacca got no service. The same thing would happen in other games as well. And this was a few games before the World Cup. At the time, I was very close to being Moyes out, but I was still Moyes in at the time. West Ham would lose to Crystal Palace. Michael Elise would score right at the end after Mikel Antonio kicking it straight at the goalkeeper instead of crossing the ball. And fans would really turn on Moyes and boo them and boo the team. And rightly so, because of the absolute dreadful performance that we had in that game. Blackburn, we played Blackburn in the Carabao Cup, changing to a 3 at the back, playing Flynn Downs in the 10 once again. And Flynn Downs never got that start against Leicester in the next league game, even though he completely deserved to start. And West Ham would end up losing to Blackburn on penalties after Angelo Bonner missed his penalty. West Ham, a game before the Premier League season, would take a halt due to the World Cup season in Qatar. West Ham would play Leicester and would lose 2-0. With Harvey Barnes scoring after Pablo Fornals giving the ball away. But also, Leicester missed a penalty. It could have been worse. And Leicester also took off Maddison and Tielemans at the time, so their best players were off. And Leicester still beat West Ham after both of them featuring in a relegation battle at one point, but Leicester would end up being fine compared to West Ham United. In fact, Leicester wouldn't end up fine. Leicester would actually get relegated in that season. Leicester were on a bit of a run at the end of that World Cup season, and just before the World Cup happened, but Rodgers would actually end up getting sacked. Dean Smith would be in charge, and they would actually get relegated. So I don't know why. I forget that was last season. The World Cup then happens. West Ham are in a relegation battle. My patience starts to go in an interview throughout when the team comes back, where West Ham would actually, Moyes would do an interview with TalkSport talking about where the European battle, not a relegation battle and stuff. But what really annoyed me was, and I was going to give Moyes the apply for, you got a break in the World Cup. You cannot keep playing your favourites now. You got to change it up. You got to play more of the new signings. But that didn't happen. That didn't happen at all. Moyes would go into the first game coming back from the World Cup, which was against Arsenal, where West Ham would lose 3-1 with some of the most embarrassing goals conceded ever, due to the likes of Fabianski and Vladimir Sufa having howlers on the night. And as soon as that lineup came out, I was Moyes out then. That was when I started being Moyes out. Was that game. It wasn't because we lost to Arsenal, it's because we put out the same lineup. We would then embarrassingly lose to 2-0 at home to Brentford as well. And that's where most people started to turn. They were still very divided, but most people started to turn. Because as much as they would be aware of the credit in the bank and Moyes, we would be grateful for David Moyes. Moyes would end up staying, but it would have been time for him to go then. But he ended up staying throughout the season. And West Ham was still losing. Lost away to Wolves. We did beat Brentford in the FA Cup. We would end up losing to Manchester United and bottling a 1-0 lead at Old Trafford. But West Ham, as I mentioned earlier, would never usually get beat by 2 goals. But the patterns were there. They were already losing to teams at home by 2 goals, such as Manchester City, Brighton, and Crystal Palace. And Brentford. Because Crystal Palace was 2-1. So less than Brentford. Both of those games were 2-0. But it would get worse. It would get worse. 2 major games where the fans turned on Moyes even more was Brighton 4-0 and Newcastle 5-1 at home. Let's start with Brighton 4-0. This was when prime Rob De Zerbi Brighton popping the ball around, McAllister, Caicedo balling out, etc. And West Ham barely got the ball throughout that whole first half. West Ham would end up losing 4-0 after an embarrassing performance from the defence, especially Ben Johnson, who was absolutely awful. Mitoma gave him a horrid time. And West Ham would lose 4-0. Fans would turn on him expeditiously. But Newcastle 5-1 at home was potentially even worse. Because West Ham were actually okay on the night and still conceded 5 goals. Now, Tilo Kehrer had a bad performance. Kurt Zouma had a bad performance. Thomas Suchek would have a bad performance. Paquetá would have a bad performance. Declan Rice would have a bad performance. There was a lot of people that had a bad performance on the night. But Newcastle would win 5-1. And this is where I start heavily disliking David Moyes. Because Moyes would actually come out criticising the fans for being upset and leaving. So that was the reason why there was a David Moyes out banner in the next league game against Fulham where West Ham would actually win 1-0. A good defensive performance would end up actually benefiting West Ham at the end of I'm pretty sure it was an own goal that was scored by Fulham that ended up winning 1-0. And this was a good Fulham side after getting promoted in their first season. First season coming back under Marco Silva. But that was why there was a Moyes out banner. And Moyes would end up coming out and saying it would hurt his feelings just before the Fiorentina game that there was a Moyes out banner. But the context was that David Moyes was criticising the fans. So there wasn't really much excuses from David Moyes. However, it will come to the end of the season and West Ham will pretty much confirm survival of relegation against Manchester United after winning 1-0. Said Benrahma pretty much passing the ball to De Gea and De Gea bobbling it into the net. A terrible howler from David De Gea. Games like 4-0 Bournemouth, despite 4-3 Palace, we ended up staying up. And then it will come to AZ Alkmaar. Throughout the Conference League, West Ham would beat Ghent 4-1 after coming back from 1-0. One of the greatest European nights I've seen at West Ham. I couldn't contain myself when Declan Rice scored that goal where he goes through the whole team and just, well, not the whole team, but like just driving with the ball and scoring at the end like prime Yaya Toure. But Alkmaar were a team that wanted to waste time, but they couldn't. West Ham would win 2-1 after coming back from 1-0 down again, coming unbeaten in the squad in this whole tournament. And the only time they wouldn't win would be Ghent away after Moyes changed to a 3 at the back, and that's pretty much why West Ham lost. West Ham didn't win that game because we could have made it 100% record throughout the whole time, but it didn't happen. Now we go to Alkmaar away. At this point, guys, I remember the whole day. I was downing alcohol because I was nervous. I've never been more nervous in my life before the Alkmaar game and the Fiorentina game. Those were the 2 games where I was so nervous. But West Ham had a defensive masterclass against Alkmaar, completely shutting down everything that Alkmaar were doing. Alkmaar were very predictable, and you could play that type of football in the Conference League because a lot of teams would want to play football, but it was very predictable, slow football. So that's what happened, really. But Pablo Fornals would end up nutmegging a man and slotting it right home, and we would have a great night. Unfortunately, Alkmaar fans would try and spoil it, but big up Nosey and beat up most of the Alkmaar guys that tried breaking in. And yeah, I hope Alkmaar fail for the rest of my life. I hope they fail. Cocky players try to waste time and then try beating up people's families. West Ham players will actually go and try and scrap them as well. Such as people like Flynn Downs, Lucas Paquetá, etc. Even Marlon Harewood was getting involved. And West Ham would be through to the Europa Conference League final. West Ham would already be up, so we would lose to Leicester on the last day of the season, but West Ham were already up. Leicester unfortunately got relegated due to the fact that Everton beat Bournemouth after doing their job against us. West Ham fans would take the piss, of course. But the last game of the season was Fiorentina versus West Ham United. What a game. And in the build-up, their manager was talking about professional fouls, slowing the game down, etc. But he would stick to his word, and that's how their team would perform. The referee was terrible on the night, but it didn't matter. I was also nervous for this game as well. I was, again, downing as many Coronas as possible. Did the same for Alkmaar, did the same for this game, and I was just too nervous. I was downing Coronas after when we won. Because I went to the parade afterwards, I was fine. I didn't have a hangover. I was drunk on the night. I was drunk on my match reaction, so if you want to check that out, it's literally when you click on the channel, that's the first video that you can see. It's my reaction to winning the final. I was quite drunk. I wasn't as drunk as I usually am, but I was drunk in that match reaction. And what a night. What a night that was. Now, West Ham would actually score a penalty first, because it was a blatant handball. Cyber Rama would score. They would end up scoring like 5 minutes later. Bonaventura scoring for AC Milan. It'll come to the 89th minute. Thomas Souček miskicks the ball. It falls to Paquetá. Ball rolls, puts it through to Jared Bowen. And I remember the exact commentary. I'm not going to repeat it, but everyone knows the commentary because you've probably watched that game about 20 million times if you're a West Ham fan. And West Ham would win a trophy after Jared Bowen puts the ball in the back of the net. And you can actually watch the full Stratford parade on my channel as well. That's one of the most viewed videos on my channel. Obviously, it's full of copyright music and stuff, but I don't care. Put it on the channel. It's out there. And you can go and watch that. I've watched it back since. It was a great day. And we're going to talk about the final again on the 1 year anniversary. So that's in a couple of weeks. And West Ham would win the final. Moyes would be on the last year of his contract. Declan Rice would leave for 105 million. His last game being the cup win. And we get into the 23-24 season, which is this season, which ended yesterday. Moyes should have left on a high and maintained that. A day after, we were linked to Harvey Barnes by Matt Law. Newcastle ended up pipping West Ham to Harvey Barnes, and I would be very angry. That's another video on this channel because I'm a big fan of Harvey Barnes. West Ham would end up missing out on him. Another target West Ham had missed out on. And he would end up coming back to haunt us in that 4-3. Now, here's where everything changes. Former Bayer Leverkusen technical director Tim Steiden comes in and is hired by David Sullivan after Rob Newman is slowly phased out as chief scout at the club. I'm pretty sure he's still at the club, but I don't know. We don't ever hear about Rob Newman now. 4 signings come in, but the problem is with these 4 signings that they're all pretty much after pre-season. So Kudus, Mavropanos, Alvarez and Ward-Prowse all sign during the Premier League season pretty much. In fact, Ward-Prowse played the first game of the Championship season against Sheffield Wednesday for Southampton and would end up then joining West Ham. Southampton could get promoted again. You never know. Flynn Downs would leave on loan. Tilo Kehrer and Ben Rama would leave in January. Ben Rama is yet to be fully permanent to Lyon, but Tilo Kehrer has been put out there to Monaco after becoming well, statistically one of the best French defenders in the league. I've not watched him since he's left. Angelica Skamaka would leave. So West Ham would take another loss on that. West Ham would also end up getting battered by Bayer Leverkusen throughout the pre-season, which is very funny now, looking back at how Bayer Leverkusen have also done, and the fact that West Ham faced Bayer Leverkusen in the Europa League, got absolutely finished, and Moyes would treat it like a normal game and change for a 3 in the back throughout getting battered. And West Ham getting battered would be a trend in this season. Now, it's funny because the fan base was divided anyway now, because Moyes has even more credit in the bank after winning the trophy, and after being rumours that Steiner and Moyes had fallen out, and according to the Athletic, recent reports have come out that the relationship is slightly fractured due to the fact that Moyes wanted Premier League experienced players and Steiner wanted to experience the European market. So that's how that would go. And we would see that Moyes and Steiner don't like each other anyway, but Steiner's just doing his job, and Moyes is pressed. West Ham would actually have a good start to the season. The fixtures would come out, and the first game of the season was Bournemouth. It wasn't a great game, but West Ham would draw to Bournemouth. But West Ham would also beat Chelsea at home, as we always do, beat them with 10 men, but would then end up having a great result, a fantastic result against Brighton away. The first time West Ham beat Brighton in the Premier League era, which was mad. 3-1 on the day. Mavropanos and Kudus would make their debuts later. But that's what would end up happening. West Ham would then beat Luton before the first international break. Now, West Ham wouldn't have a great next 4 games before the second international break, but they would be back in the Europa League, beating Mikeytimmo, coming back from 1-0 down, and also having an Olympiacos in their group who are in the Europa Conference League final at that point as well. But West Ham would end up topping the group in the Europa League this season. So it is what it is. And also having Freiburg, who they also faced in the knockout stage, becoming unbeaten in the group stage once again. And throughout the second international break, where West Ham would lose to Manchester City, Liverpool, beat Lincoln in the Cup, beat Sheffield United at home, and draw to Newcastle, where we should have won, in my opinion, and beating Freiburg away, I was starting to be a little bit positive. You can even see that video is also on the channel. I was never Moyes in throughout this season, but I was a little bit more positive. However, it wouldn't last much longer, because West Ham already cemented themselves in a certain position where the league was so inconsistent that they could only win a certain amount of games and stay in a certain position. So they wouldn't fall too long. They wouldn't be relegated. They wouldn't be battling for relegation. They wouldn't be finishing even mid-table up until the last part of the season. Because West Ham after that would end up getting beaten by a team they always beat in Aston Villa, who would end up having a great season, don't get me wrong, but teams have won at Villa Park. Aston Villa won a roll at Villa Park at that point. They would end up losing to Aston Villa. They would end up losing to Olympiacos away. They would end up losing to Everton at home, beating Arsenal in the Cup, losing to Brentford, beating Olympiacos, and then just about beating Nottingham Forest at home. West Ham were winning off moments. David Moyes was trying weird things tactically, playing Paquetá off the left, playing Ward-Prowse in the 10, playing Ward-Prowse on the left, Souček sometimes in the 10. None of this was working. Divine Mubama was promised first-team football, and contract talks comes out after the fact he doesn't want to sign a new contract. David Moyes would force himself to play him a couple games. He would end up making an impact in the Burnley away game, where West Ham just about beat Burnley away from home. West Ham just about beat Bakatopola away from home right at the end. Maxwell Corday putting the cross in after coming on for Souček, and Corday never gets a start or a single appearance ever again. West Ham would then have a terrible game against Crystal Palace after sitting back after 1 goal, but then West Ham United would beat Tottenham away after having a good defensive performance but weren't great going forward, but would win off the moments in that game to beat Tottenham. But they were 3 points behind Tottenham at one point. West Ham were 3 points behind Tottenham. So what did West Ham do when they want to have a chance to keep up with the likes of Tottenham, the likes of Villa in the top four? They would go and get battered 5-0 to Fulham. So Moyes would stop playing defensive football for 2 games, and we end up beating Freiburg 2-0 at home and Wolves 3-0 at home. So people think that Moyes has binned off the defensive football. Oh, no. Moyes decides to play the second team against Liverpool away from home in the Carabao Cup for God knows why, and would end up losing 5-1. West Ham would then beat Manchester United 3-0, 2-0, 3 days before Christmas. A great performance. Them having a lot of injuries, but also, who cares? We beat them. We did all right that day. A great defensive performance, even though Arsenal did miss a few chances, don't get me wrong, but a great defensive performance against Arsenal at their ground, ended up beating them 2-0. Scoring a set piece and a very messy goal at the start. West Ham would lose Paquetá. West Ham haven't won a game without him throughout the whole season, but Paquetá would end up having a dip of form throughout the second half of the season. West Ham would draw 0-0 with Brighton, starting off 2024 on a meaty note. West Ham would also lose to Bristol City in the FA Cup and the FA Cup round replay after bottling it at home, making it 1-1. West Ham would also bottle it against Sheffield United 2-2. Also play 4 defensive midfielders after signing Calvin Phillips against Bournemouth, drawing 1-1. Losing to Manchester United 3-0, losing to Arsenal 6-0, losing to Forest 2-0, then finally beating Brentford after actually going to attack the game 4-2, beating Everton 3-1, losing to Freiburg away 1-0, drawing to pretty much relegated Burnley at home 2-2, battering Freiburg 5-0, bottling it against Aston Villa due to Moyes taking off Antonio for Ben Johnson, which would then end up having West Ham invite pressure on, and Aston Villa would somehow get a point out of that game, even though they were awful. Newcastle would end up beating West Ham United 4-3 after West Ham were 3-1 up at home, at their ground, sorry. A disaster class from Calvin Phillips, forget the penalty. Harvey Barnes absolutely skins Calvin Phillips, and Harvey Barnes will come back to haunt West Ham United. Now, the fan base would be divided throughout, and West Ham would end up having 4 wins in the Premier League in 2024. Going on a bad note once again. But also, losing to Leverkusen in the Europa League, which is, you don't take much shame at the team that's gone unbeaten in over a year and is about to do a treble. However, West Ham sat back and ended up losing 2-0, which didn't give West Ham much to go off. So West Ham would draw 1-1 and lose 3-1 in aggregate. West Ham would also lose to Fulham at home after beating Wolves away and drawing with Tottenham at home. And the Fulham at home game pretty much kills any hope of West Ham getting any sort of European football, even though it was mathematically still there, because they would end up getting battered but to Crystal Palace and drawing at home to Liverpool. However, West Ham would lose to Chelsea and get battered, and it will be announced that David Moyes would leave the club at the end of the season the next day. And West Ham would advance in talks with Julian Lopetegui. Last week, West Ham United beat Luton, but yesterday, West Ham would lose to Manchester City, meaning that Manchester City would win the league. Now, throughout this, that is how David Moyes' reign has gone at West Ham from 2019 to 2024. I could have talked about 2018 as well, but if you guys like this video, I'm going to do West Ham Premier League years. I'm going to do a full-length 3-part series on West Ham Premier League years up until the second Moyes era that I've just done. So if you like that, I'll do research in it and you'll get a summer series of West Ham's Premier League years. But that is how David Moyes' reign has ended. If you are at the end of the video, you are a legend. You are literally a legend. This has taken an hour. This is uncut. And I've made notes. I read. But this is my video for today. Thank you guys for watching. Leave a like on the video. We are on the road to 500 subscribers. If you have watched all the way to the end and you enjoyed, please just subscribe. We're trying to hit 500 subscribers before the end of the year. That's the least you can do. And leave a like on the video. And yeah, social medias are in the description if you want to follow me. And the email for the inquiries. I'll see you guys later. Goodbye.